Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. Good to see you as always, Clyde. And for those who are with us here live, um, feel free to make comments and share your thoughts or questions. And if you're watching this in the future, then let us know what you like and what you don't like. And I want to thank all the people who have been checking out the recorded versions of Consciousness Raising Online. We've seen a growth that in some cases is phenomenal. Today, I want to talk about two things that, two areas of our culture and our lives that are very, very important. Um, because it's more important than ever. You know, black folks, we we tend to use media a lot. And the reason why I named today's session, we sing and dance, but we own so little. And what I'm talking about is so outrageous that it's almost unbelievable. Let's start out this way. Talk about television for a minute. It was after World War II that commercial television basically started coming into the homes. Really didn't get really moving until we got into the 50s, the 1950s. Um, but it was such a powerful move. Television, or as some call it, television. But we have to understand some things about television when it came into commercial use into the homes. For the generation that was grown, they saw television basically as radio with pictures. Um, for those who were young, who were essentially raised on television, television was much more than just simply radio with words or with pictures. And I've talked about this before, but I'll just mention it again. Uh, those of us who were born in what they call baby boomers, who were born roughly between 1945 and 1965, we were the first television generation. And we experienced the world differently than any generation before because of television. And you know, we were also the first generation to experience the teenage. And I have to break this down a little bit because for some people, they really don't understand how powerful this is. In other words, before the 1950s, there was no such thing as a teenager. You had people who reached their teens, but that was not a term that was used. That was not a recognized demographic. You were a child, then you were a young person, then you were grown. Teenage, or the teenager, was actually a creation of Madison Avenue because it created a whole demographic that could be addressed separately from adults and separately from children. And they did a lot of things to help create this teenager. I like to point out that if you want to find out about where teenagers really got their ideas from how to be a teenager, look at movies like Rebel Without a Cause. Even though the people that were playing the teenagers were not teenagers, but it was about teenagers. And it also introduced or helped push this idea of something called angst, teenage angst. Angst or anxiety with being a teenager. It included being rebellious against your parents. It meant doing things that were very dangerous or chancy or risky or whatever. It was being a teenager. And with that came certain clothes that teenagers wore, certain music that teenagers listened to, and all of those things. And so that was a creation. Now, when television first came into the home, there were basically, in the beginning, there was only one channel, but they soon became three basic channels or networks. That was NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, and CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting Company. And they had what was called um, free TV. But I like to point out that it was also known as commercial television because it wasn't free. Um, the reason why it was called commercial television is because they did what? They had commercials. And how did you pay? We paid by watching. You see, the network sold our eyeballs to advertisers. They said, hey, we have X number of eyeballs watching our station, our network. And so that's why it's called commercial television, but they sold it to the public as being free. First of all, you couldn't watch it if you didn't have a television. So you had to buy a TV, right? You also couldn't watch it if you didn't have electricity. And you had to pay your electric bill every week, every month. So there was two things you had to pay for directly out of pocket. But the third thing you paid, you didn't even realize that you were paying, and that was your eyeballs. And what they didn't explain about television was that television took over our minds. It hypnotized us. And so television stole the soul of young America. So many parents put their children in front of the television as a babysitter because they thought it was just radio with pictures and didn't realize that television was teaching their children things that parents never realized they were being taught. Now, for years, what was it? NBC, CBS, and ABC, which were privately owned networks, they had about 90% of the television market from the 1950s through the 1970s. That's a generation from the 50s to the 70s. And then you had the first network to come into being that rivaled them or joined them was Fox. And I can clearly recall when Fox first hit the set, they said, oh, it doesn't matter. It don't count. It don't this. It don't that. But we also didn't know who owned it and didn't realize what the game plan was. See, now when you stop and think about Fox. What is Fox? It's huge. And it also became the right wing platform on television. Fox News, right? But when it first came out, people didn't have that understanding. Fox also was the network that first challenged the big three with programming aimed specifically at black people. Yeah, remember? If you go back and look, if you weren't born, go back and look at the history. They were running TV shows with black folks in them and aimed at black folks, sitcoms mostly. And we, black folks, helped make Fox into a major player. And the history also shows that when they got to be a major player, What do? They dump them black TV shows and the black folks who helped make them. Yep. Um, you have to understand too that by 1999, 98% of American households had at least one TV, and a whole lot of homes had more than one. Some had more than two. Some households, everybody in the house had a TV, or at least there was one in every room, except and maybe even including the bathroom. But I know a lot of folks they had TVs in the living room, the bedrooms, the kitchen, the garage. Now that was all into the 70s, but then you had something break out in the 80s that changed everything for the so-called free TV, and that was the breakout of pay cable TV, and that broke the monopoly of the big three, and including Fox. And by the end of the century and the millennium, close to 70% of American households, that's 7 out of 10, had a subscription to cable TV. Now, cable TV came into being really to help people who lived in mountainous or geographically remote areas who couldn't receive over the air TV. But then, what really blew cable up was something called the satellite. The satellite. Yeah, that was when they started putting them satellites up there and they found they could bounce TV off of it. Ooh, boy, they went crazy. Remember how people went and started buying the satellite dishes and you started seeing them? First, it was big old satellite dishes, and only people who were really serious or had the money could get one of them big old dishes, put it in a yard, and then as they got smaller, they put them on their roof. Man, and all of this was playing with the idea of TV as we had known it. But now you got a new generation coming up who came up with cable. They grew up with cable. They grew up with seeing lots and lots of different channels. And so they were much harder to, it was much harder to build loyalty by the big three networks or the big four now. It was a challenge. And that was killing them. So they had to, the big four had to come to terms with it and try to take it over. Now, um, let me see. HBO is one of the first all movie channels, and that was owned by Time. Remember Time magazine? Yeah. It was the first one to distribute their signal via satellite. HBO, home box office. And the next one to use satellite was a local television station in the ATL in Atlanta, owned by Ted Turner. This was deep at the time because it became known as the first superstation. It bounced the signal off of a satellite to reach a nationwide audience. And what did Ted Turner do? He also introduced the first 24-hour news station, CNN. Yeah. See, we take all this for granted nowadays, but understand this was going on, all this stuff was going on in the 70s, into the 80s, and into the 90s. Then you had 1993, MTV, music television. And it programmed rock music. Now, by 1993, MTV had an audience of 46 million people in the United States and 32 other countries. And understand these were all, virtually all, young people, teenagers and just above teenage. It was like wow. At the time, parents had no clue how much MTV was programming their children. And then as it kept growing and kept growing and kept growing, um, they started doing what's called narrowcasting. And narrowcasting caused, folks to basically be channeled into certain demographics. That's where you started hearing words like demos and demographics and all of that, right? Um, and it's been going crazy since then. Now, you had an advance in digital technology, and more homes, cities, and homes with fiber optic cable. And that created a whole thing of not just television, but other services, but especially movies and music and all of that. So you got movies on demand, and it allows a viewer to choose between several thousand videos, right? Then you got shop at home channels. The shopping channels, they made millions and millions and hundreds of millions and billions of dollars shopping at home. And it's caused a lot of home wrecking. I personally know about some. um, one of my wives, one of my ex-wives, she was addicted to home shopping networks, and literally uh, drove us into just ugly debt. And it took a lot to get out of that. It wasn't funny. I mean, she was so addicted to it. She used to sneak and order stuff, have it sent to her friends' houses and stuff. Oh man, it was crazy. Now, here's what I want you to understand. In the United States today, there are basically 1,783 full power licensed UHF and VHF commercial and educational television stations in the United States. Let me say this again. There are 1,783 full power licensed UHF and VHF commercial and educational television stations operating in the United States. There are 10 black owned TV stations. You heard me. 1,783 TV stations in the United States. 10 are owned by black people. Now, I want you to understand the difference between owning a TV station and having a network. Because there's a network called Bounce. That network is essentially black owned. It's a network, but it's not a TV station. Um, Let me put it like this. It's kind of like in the music business. An artist might get their own label, but that label is still distributed by another company, which is white owned. And that label, in terms of when they made records and when they made CDs, we didn't manufacture these actual records or CDs. We still had to go to somebody to make them. Now with digital, it's a little different in that you don't have that physical product that has to be made. But because of the ownership of the distribution channels, You could have your own label nowadays, and you can make your own product because it's digital. MP3s, and you can even make your own videos and put them on YouTube and stuff, right? So there's a little bit more room, but you also have a fracturing of the channels. So where do you go um, to distribute your television? You know, who makes the TV shows? Do you know any black-owned TV networks that make their own TV shows? Or do we still have black folks making TV shows that are owned by the networks, by the white networks? You see, Empire and Shonda Rhimes shows, How to Get Away with Murder and Scandal and all these different shows. Where are they shown at? They're shown on the networks, on the white-owned networks. And those networks own those products. Yeah, it's ugly. 1,783 full-power TV stations, 10 are black-owned. That's unbelievable and incredible. All right, but now let's move on to the next level because that was television. Radio, uh, the majority of black folks in this country listen to radio. In fact, it is the number one vehicle that black folks use. Radio is number one, television number two. Smartphones is getting up there, it's at 81%. But radio is still number one. Okay? And let's talk about some radio. The beginning of regularly commercially licensed sound broadcasting in the United States basically began in 1920. Okay? It opened the door to other electronic media because before that it was basically print, magazines and newspapers. By 1928, the United States had basically three national radio networks, but two of them were owned by NBC, National Broadcasting Company. They owned two of the three radio networks. The other one was owned by CBS, Columbia Broadcasting, the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS. Okay? In 1998, the number of United States commercial radio stations, and again, there's that word, because again, people think radio is free. And it was called commercial radio. Why? Because they did the same thing. They had commercials. We paid with our ears. And by 1998, there were 4,793 AM stations, 5,662 FM stations. There were also 1,460 public radio stations. Okay? Now today, there are roughly 15,330 radio stations. Okay? And that means commercial and public. I want you to understand something here. 15,000 plus radio stations in the United States. In 1995, there were 146 black-owned radio stations. Today, there are only about 68. Let me say that again. In 1995, there were 146 black-owned radio stations. Today, there's 68. 68 black-owned radio stations in the United States out of 15,330. That's ugly. That's ugly. And if you're texting something in the at the website at commercial consciousness raising online, I can't see it right now. So hopefully I'll get those any questions and comments in a little bit. Maybe Clyde, if you could transfer them over there to the Desti site, I can see those. All right, but now here's the deal. See, we have to understand the difference between black owned and black oriented, because we are big business for business. Okay? We are big business for business. As you look at these urban radio companies, and see that became the word to disguise radio that was aimed at black people, but you didn't call it black radio. You started calling it urban radio in roughly the early 1980s, late 70s. I know because I was part of that movement. Because what happened was that the majority of people in the United States had grown up listening to AM radio, and black folks the same way. And then in the late 70s, there was a movement, a shift to FM radio. That's when you had the rise of the boom box, because you could get a big sound out of it. And FM radio didn't fade out when you went into a building or under a railroad tracks or viaduct or whatever. And so you had the rise of what we call urban radio. Today, a company called iHeartMedia owns 117, quote, urban radio stations. They actually own thousands of radio stations, but they own 117 that are urban. Then you have Urban One, which owns 48 urban stations. But understand, Urban One started out as Radio One. That was a black-owned company. It went public, so it still has black folks majority ownership, but it's a black woman that owns it, and her son, they run it. They also have what's called TV One, but that's a partnership with Comcast, I believe it is, so they don't really own the majority of that. The only other group in this top 10 list that I'm showing, Perry Publishing at number 8, Perry Publishing and Broadcast Company. They own 12 stations. And I believe Beasley Media Group LLC, which owns 9 stations, I believe they're black owned too. But all the rest are white owned with no question. And they dominate the urban radio marketplace. In fact, in a city like Chicago, and again, I know this because I was part of it. In the 80s, when I first went into commercial radio, there were, 5 or 6 different, no, more like 8 stations that programmed to black audiences. Um, only three were black owned at the time. One of them was John H. Johnson of Johnson Publishing Company. He had a radio station. In fact, that's where Tom Joyner first worked in Chicago. um, and that was one of the reasons why Harold Washington was able to be elected mayor, because of the strength of black radio and black oriented radio. Now, the black owned stations and black oriented stations that existed then, the only one that exists now is WVON, an AM station by its little self. The black owned and black oriented stations of yesterday, yesteryear, all owned by white companies. iHeartMedia owns the two biggest urban stations in Chicago, and it's a sad situation because they not only own WGCI, which I worked for years, and B103, which was a older adult black station. They also own an AM gospel station, and they have a agreement with WVON, which used to be Voice of the Negro, now it stands for Voice of the Nation, where they loaned or leased one of their little throwaway AM stations to WVON. But I want to talk for a quick minute about why or how it got to be this way, where there's 15,000 plus radio stations and there are less than 70 black owned stations in America. How can that be? Well, let's talk about something called the FCC for a minute. When the FCC came into existence, part of what they were supposed to do was license radio stations. Would you believe that the FCC for many, many decades did expressly this? They kept black folks from owning radio stations. There's basically 6 things that the FCC did that maintained segregation of the airwaves in terms of radio station licenses. The FCC and its predecessor, which was called the Federal Radio Commission, refused to grant radio station licenses to black people and Jewish Americans until World War II. Remember I said commercial radio basically began in 1920. So for several decades, they wouldn't grant any licenses to blacks or Jews. And then when they started to do that, they granted them to Jewish people, not us. The FCC used its licensing power to facilitate the schemes of segregated state university systems to exclude black people from equal access to broadcast education. See, they didn't just say, we're not going to give you no licenses. The universities refused to allow us in the program to learn about radio broadcasting. They also licensed and relicensed open segregationists. And that prevented black folks from gaining a foothold into commercial broadcast employment. We couldn't even work at stations for generations. Then they also had these financial qualification requirements to get licensing, just like what they did with the vote, right? Yeah, you had to have this outrageous amount of money that you had to put up. And they also said you had to have broadcast experience, past broadcast record, and ownership of a daytime only station as preferential licensing criteria in order to become a minority status. Well, wait a minute. If you wouldn't give me a license and you wouldn't let me learn how to broadcast, and you wouldn't allow me to get hired, and then you turn around and say, well, these were the rules in order for you to get a license. Did that for generations. Um, Now, they also did something even after they finally started saying, okay, okay, y'all can get in the marketplace. There was something called no urban dictates, no Spanish dictates. Now, these were basically schemes in discrimination in advertising. And the way it worked was many advertisers would tell radio stations that um, we will buy advertising with your network, but you can't put our commercials on stations which served urban audiences or Spanish audiences. They were called no urban dictates and no Spanish dictates. So that meant that, number one, black and brown people didn't get to hear the advertisements for products and services that they might have needed or wanted. And two, it deprived the black stations and brown stations of the revenues that the advertising would bring. In fact, it wasn't until 2007, uh, after it cost minority advertisers, minority radio stations, broadcasters, it was costing them something like $200 million a year in revenue they weren't getting because of that discrimination. Finally, in 2007, the FCC finally banned advertising discrimination, but they haven't created any kind of enforcement program. Okay, and so now it's come back with a vengeance. They're doing it even worse now. But what they do is they direct certain advertising um, to urban and Latino radio. It's deep, y'all, I'm telling you. So, again, when you have a situation where we own what? 68 radio stations in the entire country out of 15,000? And what ends up happening is, as you're looking at these graphics, yeah, that's me in some of those photos coming from Chicago as an example. We were like the number one urban station in the entire country, but we were owned by white folks, owned by a company called Gannett back then, which was primarily in the newspaper business, right? They had newspapers, they had TV stations, they had radio stations. Um, we were huge. We were huge. And yet, we were white owned. Majority of black folks in Chicago believed for a long time that it was black owned because all the faces and everything were black folks. I know, I was one of them. Tom Joyner became the fly jock at that station, WGCI. He would do a morning show in Dallas and fly up to Chicago in the afternoon, do an afternoon show in Chicago. It's called him Fly Jock. And I guess in a way, I'm truly saddened by the fact that we have lost so much ground, uh, in that we have fewer stations today than we ever did. Now, here, let me give you a quickie on what happened. In the 1970s, the FCC said, okay, here's what we're going to do. The states, the people who owned AM stations by the ton, they owned hundreds and hundreds of them, but they wanted to get into FM radio because FM radio was getting ready to be the bomb. Okay, it was getting ready to be the thing. So what the FCC said was this: they said, what we'll do is, if you agree to sell your AM stations to quote minorities, then we'll give you heads up and an upper hand on buying or getting the licenses for FM. Now, on the one hand, that sounded real cool. Oh, all of a sudden, all these black folks gonna get these radio stations, and quite a few did. But all those folks that sold their AM station to the black folks, they turned around and got the FM stations dirt cheap, and that was the coming thing, the FM stations. It was also a killer blow to black folks in terms of AM radio, and I'll tell you why. In most cases, we could only afford to buy one AM station. Of course, we had grown up with AM radio, so we thought we was getting the deal. Oh man, I'm gonna get my own station. And I might have to pay through the nose for it because they didn't sell them to us cheap. But AM was on the way out as a major factor in terms of radio. If you didn't have a clear channel station, meaning like good example in New York, what was it, WBLS, I think it was. In Chicago, it's WLS, a couple of other places. These were radio stations, AM stations, that they owned the signal and were powerful enough that they could go all the way across the country unencumbered. Nobody else was allowed to be on that same frequency. Now that made that station very powerful. But the majority of the others, they had a license for a few miles in their city. Well, if you had one standalone AM station, you didn't have very much once FM got rolling. You couldn't play music that competed with FM because the FM, it was stereo, and it just sounded great. And like I say, AM faded in and out and all that kind of stuff. So here we are now. We got these AM stations. We got robbed. Some of them tried to do, they played black music, but the FM station started playing that same music. It was killing us. Then they tried talk. They tried black talk radio, news and talk, as a matter of fact. And that was working pretty good. The news aspect, because we had a black radio news network across the country. And of course, they killed that off. And that hurt black talk especially. But what really hurt us with black talk radio was we could not get the same level of advertising. Couldn't get the same level of advertisers because very few white companies wanted to advertise on black stations, and especially didn't want to advertise on black stations where they were doing talk, because after we got to talking, eventually we started trying to use the talking to try and solve some of the problems that black folks had. And that didn't do well with white people. They didn't want to hear black people talking about the issues. I was out. So we were starving. Black owned AM stations were starving, and they started going out of business like crazy. Oh, a few tried sports, and again, um, that worked a little, but not much, because of course AM, the big AM stations, they did the same thing. They were much better at being able to get that business, sports radio. So that's why, like in Chicago, Illinois, third largest city in the country, we have one black owned radio station, and it doesn't even put its programming over the signal that they own. What do I mean by that? They lease a signal from iHeartRadio, which is a white owned company that owns the other black oriented stations or urban stations, and they're leasing a signal from them. They don't even use their own signal because it's a crippled signal. You go to all the major cities around the country and you will find that the vast majority of radio stations that are programming to black people are white owned and part of a white owned network. So as we're in 2019, this is one of the reasons why we are not able to control our message. We don't get to control our message. We don't get to tell our story to the children. Okay, we gotta make some changes there. Um, what can I say? I know some of the information I'm sharing with you right now. You're probably saying what, but it's not any different than anything else in the United States. They make sure that um, we don't get to control, but we have to give our money to, just like our ears to, and our eyes to white owned entities. And in some areas, we're lost because the children who are now grown, who have grown up with the idea that, you don't own nothing, and the idea is to get a job on a white owned entity everywhere we look, whether it's sports, right? NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, white folks own them. Yeah, you got a black owner at a couple of basketball, but they're not major. You don't have no NFL teams owned by black folks, no baseball teams owned by black folks that I know of. Entertainment, let me just share with you this. Six corporations today own 90% of the media in the United States. Six corporations own 90% of the media. The six companies are GE, which used to mean General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. News Corp is actually Fox owned. That's the company that owns Fox. Um, of the television stations in the country, or networks that black owned or that we thought were black owned, BET, Black Entertainment Television, is now owned by Viacom. But see, Viacom always had they were half of BET in the first place. Um, TV One, which was introduced in 1995, that's part of Kathy Hughes and Radio One. or it's called Urban Radio One now. Uh, but even that network is, if they don't own most of it, they own probably half of it, and that's Comcast. So we've got to make a huge turnaround in how we look at things, and also how we teach our young people about owning. They need to understand that they don't, the goal shouldn't be just to work for white folks. It's to own the apparatus, the machinery, you know? Anyway, I don't mean to be a downer on this, but it's so, it's almost discouraging when you look at it and you say 15,000 radio stations, we own 68, 1,700 TV stations, and what, we own 10. And when you look at the internet, in terms of black owned companies that have a force in on the internet, we haven't seen it yet. So with that, I'm gonna leave you to your own research and your own thinking about this. We got to do something different. We've got to change this. We got to change it. And I appreciate you listening. Okay, Clyde, you said so. TV1 is half black owned, yeah. And with this move, we don't get to control our message. Yeah, you're exactly right. We don't get to control our message because that's how they planned it. And they tricked us into thinking it's not important to own the tools. It's just a matter of being able to sing and dance and act on their vehicles. So we sing and we dance, but we own so little. With that, I'm going to say, um, I'll see you in the whirlwind, and no justice, no peace, no love, KNOW.